sir. I am a police officer. My name is Detective Elijah Vance, Robbery Homicide Division.
Oh, you're a cop now, are you? Mouth! Get on your knees! On your knees now!
The Atlanta sun in early May had a quality of gentle insistence. It wasn't the oppressive, heavy heat of August, but a clean, bright warmth that spilled over the meticulously manicured lawns of the Havenwood Estates. It was the kind of morning that smelled of money, the faint, sweet scent of blooming gardenias mingling with the earthy aroma of fresh mulch and the clean, almost sterile scent of chlorinated water from a nearby pool filter. This was a neighborhood built as a fortress against the untidiness of the world, a place of architectural harmony where every brick, every slate roof, and every perfectly pruned boxwood hedge spoke a common language of success. For Detective Elijah Vance, at 45, this language was still new, a dialect he was slowly learning. As he stepped out of the French doors of his new home, a stately Georgian with imposing white columns, the contrast was not lost on him. For 20 years, his world had been the grit and chaos of the city's underbelly, the acrid smell of desperation in dimly lit interrogation rooms, the metallic tang of blood on pavement, the hollow echo of grief in homes shattered by violence. Serenity Lane was more than an address. It was a deliberate, hard-won sanctuary. He took a deep breath, the crisp air a balm. He was dressed for a simple weekend errand. A navy blue polo shirt that fit his broad, athletic frame, tailored khaki shorts, and clean leather boat shoes. There was nothing in his appearance that hinted at his profession, save for the quiet, watchful economy of his movements. His eyes, accustomed to scanning crowds for threats, now simply took in the peaceful suburban tableau. A sprinkler arced a jeweled spray of water across a neighbor's lawn. A high-end electric sedan hummed past silently. It was the picture of tranquility. His vehicle, a gleaming black Cadillac Escalade, sat in the cobblestone driveway catching the morning light. It was his one significant indulgence, a rolling testament to years of overtime, dangerous assignments, and a promotion to the elite Robbery Homicide Division. He clicked the key fob and the SUV responded with a subdued chirp, its running boards gliding out smoothly. He opened the driver's door and tossed a small gym bag onto the passenger seat, the supple leather sighing under the weight. He was just heading out to a specialized training facility, a Saturday ritual to keep his skills sharp. It was in that moment, as he paused to retrieve his sunglasses from the center console, that he first felt it. It was a familiar sensation, a prickle on the back of his neck that his police instincts had honed to a razor's edge, the feeling of being watched. He didn't react immediately. He continued his fluid motion, placing the sunglasses on his face, his movements relaxed and unhurried. But his senses were now fully engaged, his peripheral vision expanding, his ears tuning into the subtle soundscape of the street. The source was a house 2 doors down, a newer, sprawling, modern farmhouse design that had just been sold. A couple, both of whom appeared to be in their late 30s, were standing on their immaculate porch. They were the picture of suburban success. The man, Chad, was tall and lean in a pastel golf shirt and shorts. The woman, Karen, was blonde and fit in expensive athletic wear. They weren't just glancing his way, they were staring. It was a fixed, unblinking scrutiny, devoid of the casual curiosity one might give a new neighbor. Their postures were rigid, their faces tight with something he couldn't quite decipher from this distance, but it felt cold, proprietary. Elijah had lived in his new home for just over a month. He had exchanged polite, brief waves with a few other residents, but he hadn't met this particular couple yet. He offered them a slight, almost imperceptible nod, the universal sign of acknowledgement, the simple gesture of a neighbor. There was no response. Chad's arms crossed over his chest, a defensive, territorial posture. Karen murmured something to him, her expression hardening. Then she raised her smartphone, not in an obvious way, but angling it just enough to be unmistakable. She was recording him. A cold knot began to form in Elijah's stomach. This was not a welcome. This was an assessment, an accusation waiting to be spoken. He had seen that look 1,000 times in his career, the look of someone who had already decided who he was and what he was doing, based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the car he was about to drive. The beautiful Saturday morning suddenly felt brittle, as if the perfect blue sky could crack at any moment. Chad Brewer watched the man by the Escalade, his jaw set. "You see that?" he muttered to his wife, his voice a low rumble of conviction. "He's been out there for 5 minutes, just walking around it, looking." "I see it," Karen replied, her voice tight with a self-righteous anxiety she mistook for civic duty. Her thumb hovered over the screen of her phone, the camera app open. "He doesn't fit. You just don't see that in this neighborhood." The "that" hung in the air, a lazy, poisonous cloud. It wasn't just about the man, it was about the combination. The man, the car, the house. To the Brewers, it was a discordant note in the carefully composed symphony of their world. They had just moved in 2 weeks ago, having stretched their finances to the absolute limit to buy into the perceived safety and prestige of Havenwood Estates. Their purchase was not just a home, it was an identity, a shield, and in their hyper-vigilant minds, any perceived anomaly was a potential threat to that fragile identity. Elijah, still by his car, could feel the intensity of their gaze. He chose to ignore it, to proceed with his routine, believing that normalcy was the best antidote to whatever strange paranoia was brewing on that porch. He closed his driver's side door with a solid, satisfying thud and walked around to the passenger side to ensure he had locked the rear door from his last trip. It was a simple, reflexive action, the kind of mundane check anyone might perform. But seen through the Brewer's distorted lens of suspicion, it was damning evidence. "He's checking the other doors now," Chad hissed, taking a step forward as if he were a sentinel at his post. "He's testing them. This is how they do it. They act casual, like they belong, waiting for an opportunity." "Someone's paying him to scope the place out," Karen added, her imagination now running wild, constructing a narrative from the thinnest of air. "Or he's going to drive off with it. That's an expensive vehicle, easy 100 grand right there." Their confirmation bias was a runaway train. Every action Elijah took was filtered through their pre-existing conclusion. His calm demeanor wasn't innocence. It was the cool confidence of a professional criminal. His nice clothes weren't a sign of his own success. They were a disguise. The luxury SUV wasn't his property. It was his target. Their fear, which had started as a vague unease, was now crystallizing into a certainty that felt as solid and real as the marble countertops in their new kitchen. They were not witnessing a man getting into his own car. They were witnessing a felony in progress. "That's it, I'm calling," Karen declared, her voice filled with a tremor of manufactured panic and a strange thrill of impending action. "We can't just stand here and do nothing." "Good, do it," Chad urged, puffing out his chest. He felt a surge of adrenaline, of purpose. He wasn't just a homeowner, he was a protector, a guardian of the neighborhood's sanctity. Karen turned her back to the street, creating the illusion of privacy, and dialed 911. When the dispatcher's calm, professional voice came on the line, Karen's own voice shifted, becoming a high-pitched, breathless instrument of panic. "Yes, hello. I need police, quickly. We're at 114 Serenity Lane in Havenwood Estates. There's a man, a black man. He's trying to steal a car in our neighbor's driveway." She paused, listening, her eyes darting back towards Elijah, who was now getting into the driver's seat. "A black Cadillac Escalade. He's been casing it for several minutes, trying the doors. He looks very aggressive. He saw us watching him and gave us a threatening look." The lies slid out easily, greased by adrenaline and prejudice. She was no longer just reporting a suspicion, she was painting a picture, carefully choosing words she knew would provoke the most immediate and forceful response. Aggressive, threatening. The dispatcher asked for a description. "He's tall, athletic build, wearing a dark polo shirt. He's acting like he's on something, very agitated." Another lie. Elijah's movements had been the epitome of calm. "Please, you need to hurry. I think he might be armed. We're very scared. He's getting in the car now. He's going to drive away with it! She ended the call, her heart hammering in her chest. A mixture of fear, excitement, and a profound sense of righteousness washed over her. She had done the right thing. She had protected her home, her family, her neighborhood. She lowered the phone and looked at her husband, her eyes wide. "They're on their way," she breathed. "They said they're sending a car immediately. Code 3. Chad nodded, his expression grim and satisfied. "Good. Let's see him talk his way out of this." They stood together on their porch, two self-appointed judges who had already tried, convicted, and sentenced their neighbor, eagerly awaiting the arrival of the executioner. The beautiful morning was about to be torn apart, and they were the ones who had handed over the shears. Elijah started the Escalade's engine, the powerful V8 rumbling to life with a low, satisfying growl. The premium sound system filled the cabin with the cool, intricate notes of a jazz quartet. He buckled his seatbelt, adjusted his rearview mirror, and was about to shift the vehicle into reverse when the sound pierced the tranquil morning. It started as a faint, distant wail, but grew with shocking speed into a piercing, multiphonic shriek. He instinctively checked his mirrors again. A black and white Atlanta PD cruiser, its light bar flashing a dizzying strobe of red and blue, was barreling down Serenity Lane at a speed utterly alien to the quiet 25-mile-per-hour street. Before he could even process the reason for its presence, the cruiser didn't just pull up, it executed a tactical maneuver. The driver slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming in protest, and swung the car's nose in, coming to an abrupt halt at a sharp angle directly behind the Escalade, boxing it in. The message was clear and unambiguous. You are not going anywhere. Elijah's mind, honed by 2 decades of law enforcement, went into immediate analytical mode. Felony stop. High risk. Weapon reported. He knew the procedure because he had performed it himself dozens of times. He also knew the extreme danger inherent in such a stop for everyone involved. His own heart rate began to climb, not with fear, but with a cold, professional awareness. The cruiser's doors flew open simultaneously. 2 uniformed officers emerged, their movements a blur of practiced aggression. They didn't use their own car doors for cover in a textbook fashion. Instead, they burst out, creating a terrifying visual of overwhelming force. The senior officer, a man in his late 30s with a thick neck and a face set in a permanent scowl, already had his service pistol drawn, held in a 2-handed grip, and aimed squarely at Elijah's head through the driver's side window. His name tag read Calloway. His partner, younger, leaner, and radiating a nervous, high-strung energy, mirrored the action on the passenger side. "Officer Riggs!" He was yelling, his voice strained and cracking with adrenaline. "Driver! Let me see your hands! Get them out the window! Now!" The commands were a percussive assault, overlapping and frantic. From across the street, the Brewers watched, their faces a mixture of fear and vindication. This was the response they had wanted, the validation of their fabricated report. Elijah's training screamed at him to comply instantly and without question. Any sudden move, any hesitation, could be misinterpreted in the heightened, adrenaline-soaked perception of the officers. He killed the engine, the sudden silence in the cabin making the shouting from outside seem even louder. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his empty hands, palms forward, and extended them out of the open driver's side window. The sun glinted off the simple, functional watch on his wrist. "Do it! Slowly! Unlock the doors!" Calloway bellowed, his voice a gravelly roar. His knuckles were white around the grip of his pistol. His focus was absolute, his gaze unwavering. He was looking at a carjacker, a dangerous felon, a threat that had to be neutralized. He wasn't seeing a man. He was seeing a target profile, one that had been preloaded into his mind by the dispatcher's call. Elijah used his left thumb to press the unlock button on the door panel. The click of the locks disengaging sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. "Driver, with your left hand, outside the vehicle, open the door, slowly!" Riggs shouted, his own weapon now trained on Elijah. This was the moment of maximum danger. Opening the door would expose his entire body. He followed the command to the letter, his movements measured and telegraphing his intent. He reached out, his fingers finding the cool metal of the handle. He pulled it, and the heavy door swung open. The jazz music, which had been his private sanctuary moments before, now spilled out onto the street, a surreal soundtrack to the unfolding nightmare. "Step out of the vehicle! Keep your hands where I can see them!" Calloway commanded. As Elijah swung his legs out and began to stand, he could see the two officers clearly. He saw the tension in their shoulders, the way their eyes were wide, pupils dilated. They were pumped full of adrenaline, operating on the ragged edge of their training. He saw the tactical positioning, designed to create a fatal crossfire. But most importantly, he saw the complete absence of curiosity in their faces. There was no question, no assessment. There was only the absolute, unshakable certainty that they were dealing with a dangerous criminal. They weren't there to investigate a situation, they were there to end one. The sun was bright, the gardenias still smelled sweet, but the world had suddenly become a very dark and dangerous place. Standing now beside the open door of his Escalade, Elijah kept his hands raised high, palms open and facing the officers. The polished barrels of 2 Glock pistols were pointed directly at his chest. The gravity of the situation was a physical weight. He could feel the eyes of the brewers on him from across the street, and he was aware of other neighbors beginning to peek through their windows, drawn by the commotion. "Sir, I am a police officer," Elijah said, his voice a low, steady baritone. He projected it to be heard, but kept the tone deliberately calm and non-threatening. He knew that the first words spoken could either de-escalate or inflame. "My name is Detective Elijah Vance, Robbery Homicide Division, Atlanta PD." The statement was met with a snort of derisive laughter from Officer Calloway. "Oh, you're a cop now, are you? That's a new one," he sneered, his aim never wavering. "Everybody's a cop or a lawyer when they're caught red-handed. Shut your mouth and listen to my commands." The dismissal was so swift, so absolute, it sent a chill through Elijah. They didn't just doubt him, they refused to even entertain the possibility. His words were nothing, just the noise of a suspect. "Get on your knees! On your knees! Now!" Riggs screamed, his voice escalating in pitch. He was bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet, a clear sign of an adrenaline dump. He was a powder keg, and Elijah knew it. "My credentials and my service weapon are in the vehicle," Elijah stated, again keeping his voice level. "My badge is in my wallet, in my back right pocket. I am trying to cooperate with you." He was providing them with a pathway to the truth, a way to diffuse this without anyone getting hurt. "I said shut your mouth," Calloway roared. "You think we're stupid? Reaching for your pocket? You want to get shot? Get on the ground!" It was a staggering, terrifying catch-22. They were demanding he prove his identity while simultaneously threatening to kill him if he made any move to do so. The logic of the situation had completely inverted. His attempt to comply was being framed as a threat. His professional status, which should have been a bridge to understanding, was being treated as a transparent lie. Elijah made a split-second calculation. The risk of being shot while standing was far greater than the indignity of complying. The primary objective was to survive the encounter. Slowly, he lowered himself to his knees on the rough, uneven surface of the cobblestone driveway. The small, sharp stones pressed painfully into his kneecaps. He kept his hands held high. "Face away from me! Cross your ankles!" He complied, turning his back to Calloway, the officer with the primary line of fire. He was now completely vulnerable, his back exposed, unable to see their movements. He could only hear their heavy, breathless footsteps on the stones behind him. "Sir, my badge is in my wallet," he repeated, his voice strained from the awkward position. "I am Detective Elijah Vance. You can run my name. You are making a mistake." The response was not verbal. It was a sudden, violent shove between his shoulder blades. The force sent him sprawling forward, his hands, which he had kept raised, instinctively shooting out to break his fall. His palms and forearms scraped against the rough cobblestones, the abrasive surface tearing at his skin. A sharp, hot pain flared through him. Before he could even register the fall, a heavy knee was driven into the center of his back, pinning him to the ground, forcing the air from his lungs in a sharp gasp. A hand grabbed his left wrist and wrenched it violently behind his back. The cold, unforgiving steel of a handcuff was slapped on, the ratchet clicking with a sickening finality. His right arm was yanked back to meet it, the cuff biting into his other wrist. He was now completely immobilized, his face pressed against the stones that smelled of dirt and motor oil. "So, you're a detective, huh?" Riggs grunted, his knee still grinding into Elijah's spine. "Let's see this badge." A hand fumbled roughly at his back pocket, pulling out his wallet. Elijah could hear it being flipped open. There was a pause. He waited for the moment of realization, the dawning understanding that they had made a catastrophic error. He heard Riggs let out a low whistle. "Well, look at that, Calloway, it's a real badge." But there was no apology in his tone, only a kind of grudging, resentful surprise. Calloway came to stand over him, his shadow falling across Elijah's head. "A badge doesn't mean you can't be a crook," Calloway said, his voice a low, menacing growl. "Just means you're a crook with a badge, and right now you're a crook who is trying to steal a car, so you can take your detective shield and shove it." The words were a final, brutal confirmation. His identity didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. They had a narrative, and they were going to see it through to its violent conclusion. His badge, the symbol of his oath and his sacrifice, offered no protection at all. It was just another piece of useless metal on a man they had already judged. The world, for Elijah Vance, had shrunk to the few square inches of cobblestone his face was pressed against. He could feel the sharp edge of a stone digging into his cheek, the warmth of his own blood trickling from the scrapes on his forearms, the oppressive weight of Officer Riggs's knee grinding into his vertebrae. The jazz music from his car had been silenced, replaced by the crackle of a police radio and the heavy, labored breathing of the men standing over him. Each click of the handcuff's ratchet as it was double-locked had been a punctuation mark in a sentence of profound and absolute degradation. He was a decorated detective. He had led task forces, stared down murderers, and comforted the families of victims. He had earned citations for bravery and commendations for his meticulous investigative work. Yet in this moment, none of that mattered. He was reduced to a faceless suspect, a piece of evidence to be processed. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, acrid taste in the back of his throat. "Get him up!" Calloway commanded, his tone dismissive. Riggs hauled Elijah to his feet by his cuffed arms, a move that sent a searing pain through his shoulders. He was unsteady for a moment, his head spinning. He stood there in the bright morning sun, in the driveway of his own home, with his hands bound behind his back. He looked across the street and saw them. Chad and Karen Brewer were still on their porch, watching the entire spectacle with expressions of grim satisfaction. They had initiated this. Their lie, their prejudice, had manifested into this physical, violent reality. They were not just witnesses, they were the architects of his debasement. "What's your name?" Calloway asked, holding Elijah's wallet, flipping through it as if it were a curiosity. "I've told you. Detect Elijah Vance." "Right, the detective," Calloway sneered, pulling the driver's license out. He looked at the picture, then back at Elijah's face. "And this is your address? 118 Serenity Lane?" "Yes," Elijah said through gritted teeth. "This is my house. That is my car." "Convenient," Riggs chimed in, a smirk playing on his lips. "You steal a car and the wallet of the guy who lives right here. Real smooth." The sheer, willful ignorance of their logic was breathtaking. They were contorting reality, inventing ever more elaborate fictions to avoid confronting the simple, glaring truth. They had made a mistake. To them, the idea of a black detective living in this house and driving this car was so fundamentally impossible that a convoluted theory of a simultaneous car and wallet theft was more plausible. It was a stark, terrifying window into a mindset so warped by prejudice that it was incapable of processing facts. "Search him," Calloway ordered. Riggs began a rough, invasive pat-down, his hands running over Elijah's body, digging into his pockets. It was a procedure designed to find weapons or contraband, but in this context, it was an act of pure domination. Elijah stood perfectly still, his jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on a distant point over Calloway's shoulder. He was building a wall inside his mind, compartmentalizing the rage and humiliation, focusing only on a cold, analytical assessment of their actions. Illegal search. No probable cause established. Arrest made under false pretenses. He was building a case in his head, even as his own rights were being systematically stripped away. "He's clean," Riggs announced, stepping back. "All right," Calloway said, snapping the wallet shut and stuffing it into his own pocket. "Let's go. You're coming with us." "On what charge?" Elijah demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. "We'll figure that out," Calloway shot back. "Attempted auto theft, resisting arrest. We'll find something that sticks. Now walk." He shoved Elijah toward the waiting patrol car. The walk was the longest of his life. It was a walk of shame, a perp walk in his own driveway. The neighbors were now openly staring, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and morbid curiosity. He was being paraded before them as a criminal. The dangerous element they all secretly feared had finally breached the pristine walls of their gated community. The irony was a bitter pill. He was the one who had spent a career protecting communities like this, and now he was being cast as its villain. They reached the patrol car. Riggs opened the back door. "Watch your head," he said with mock concern, before shoving Elijah's head down and forcing him into the cramped, hard plastic back seat. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing the closing of a cage. Through the metal grill, he watched as Calloway walked over to the Brewers, who were now coming down from their porch, eager to give their witness statements. He saw them talking, pointing animatedly at him, their faces alight with the drama they had created. The scene was surreal, a nightmare painted in the cheerful colors of a perfect Saturday morning. The back of the patrol car was hot and smelled of stale sweat and disinfectant. Elijah sat with his shoulders pressed against the hard plastic seat, the handcuffs biting into his wrists with every slight movement of the vehicle. Calloway was in the driver's seat, filling out some preliminary paperwork on a mounted laptop, while Riggs stood outside, keeping a proprietary watch over the Escalade, now officially a crime scene. Time seemed to stretch and warp. Each minute felt like an hour, filled with the low hum of the car's electronics and the cacophony of Elijah's own thoughts. His initial shock and humiliation were beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, simmering rage. It was a controlled fury, the kind he had learned to harness over years of dealing with the absolute worst of humanity. This, however, was different. This was not a criminal's rage. This was the outrage of a citizen, a protector, being betrayed by the very system he had sworn an oath to uphold. He knew that what happened next was critical. Calloway was likely trying to formulate a charge that could possibly justify the brutal arrest. The initial call was for auto theft, but a simple check of the vehicle's registration, a 30-second task, would expose that as a lie. They would have to pivot to something more subjective, like obstruction or resisting without violence. They would build a version of events where his calm assertions of his identity were twisted into belligerent non-compliance. He had to disrupt that narrative before it solidified. "Officer Calloway," Elijah said, his voice firm and clear, cutting through the silence. Calloway ignored him, his eyes fixed on his computer screen. "Officer Calloway, I am a 20-year veteran of this department. I am formally requesting that you call a supervisor to this scene immediately." This got a reaction. Calloway stopped typing and slowly turned his head. His eyes, visible in the rearview mirror, were filled with venom. The request for a supervisor was a direct challenge to his authority. In his world, it was a move used by criminals and obnoxious cop watchers to cause trouble. "You're in no position to request anything," Calloway growled. "You're in my custody." Under your department's protocol, a suspect in custody has the right to request a supervisor respond, especially when there's an allegation of misconduct, Elijah shot back, his voice like ice. "My arrest was unlawful. You have refused to verify my identity and the ownership of my vehicle. You are operating outside of established procedure, and I am demanding that a sergeant be notified." He was using their language, their rules against them. He wasn't just a suspect complaining, he was a professional citing chapter and verse. Calloway stared at him in the mirror for a long, tense moment. He knew Elijah was right. Refusing the request, especially given the context, would be a massive procedural red flag. The situation was already messy. A formal complaint of a refused supervisor request would make it infinitely worse. With a curse muttered under his breath, he grabbed his radio microphone. "Dispatch, send a supervisor to the location. Non-emergency." He was trying to downplay the situation, but the request was now on the official record. The wait was agonizing. 10 minutes passed. Calloway got out of the car and conferred with Riggs in low, angry tones. They both kept shooting glances back at Elijah, their expressions a mixture of fury and a new, dawning unease. They had been in complete control, but now a third party was coming, someone who would scrutinize their actions. Finally, another marked vehicle, a police SUV with sergeant's stripes on the sleeve of its insignia, pulled onto the street. It parked behind Calloway's cruiser, and a man in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and a weary but professional demeanor stepped out. His name tag read Walsh. Sergeant Walsh was a veteran of the street, a man who could assess a scene in seconds. He took in the entire picture: the Escalade parked in the driveway, the two agitated junior officers, the cuffed man in the back of the patrol car, and the small crowd of neighbors watching from a safe distance. He sighed. This was not a simple car theft. This was a mess. He approached Calloway first. "What's going on here, Calloway? Dispatch said you had a 1053 in progress." "That's right, Sarge," Calloway said, launching into his pre-packaged narrative. "Got the call. Suspect was attempting to steal the vehicle. He became aggressive, non-compliant. Had to take him into custody. Turns out he's claiming to be a detective." He said the last part with a roll of his eyes, as if sharing a ridiculous joke. Sergeant Walsh's eyes narrowed. "He's claiming? Did you run his name? Did you run the vehicle's tags?" Calloway hesitated for a fraction of a second too long. "We were in the process of securing the scene, Sarge. He was being belligerent. Had to get him cuffed first. Officer safety." Walsh's gaze was sharp. He had heard that excuse 1,000 times to cover up 1,000 procedural shortcuts. He ignored Calloway and walked directly to the back of the patrol car, bending down to look inside. His eyes met Elijah's. "I'm Sergeant Walsh, sir. What's your name?" "Detective Elijah Vance, robbery homicide," Elijah said, his voice hoarse. "This is my home. That is my car. Your officers have refused to verify that information and assaulted me." Walsh stared at him, really looked at him. He saw the scrapes on his face, the calm, intelligent fury in his eyes. This was not the look of a typical car thief. A knot of dread began to form in Walsh's stomach. "Calloway," he said, his voice dangerously quiet without turning around. "Give me his wallet." Calloway reluctantly handed over Elijah's wallet. Walsh took it, opened it, and saw the driver's license confirming the address. Then, he saw the official Atlanta PD ID card with its photo and bold lettering. He looked from the photo back to the man in the car. His face went pale. The dawning horror was visible, a slow-motion catastrophe unfolding before his eyes. He turned and looked at Calloway and Riggs, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "What have you two done?" he whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of a dozen impending careers crashing into ruin. The unlocking of the handcuffs was not accompanied by an apology. Sergeant Walsh performed the action himself, his movements stiff and formal. The metal sprang free from Elijah's raw, chafed wrists, but the deeper feeling of being bound remained. He climbed out of the patrol car, his legs stiff, his entire body aching from the violent encounter. The bright sun seemed to mock the dark, ugly reality of the situation. "Detective Vance, Walsh began, his face ashen. He was a man adrift, stripped of his procedural charts in the face of an institutional nightmare. Elijah cut him off, not out of anger, but out of a need for control. "Sergeant, is the scene secure?" he asked, his voice flat and professional. It was a bizarre question, but it was his way of reasserting his own identity, of reclaiming the language of his profession. Yes, Detective," Walsh stammered. "Are Officers Calloway and Riggs a threat to me at this time?" "No, sir." "Then I'd like my property returned," Elijah said, gesturing toward his wallet and keys, which Walsh was still holding as if they were venomous. Walsh handed them over immediately. Elijah pocketed them, his movements deliberate. He then turned his gaze toward Calloway and Riggs. They were standing by their cruiser, utterly defeated, the swagger and aggression completely drained from them, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed fear. They wouldn't meet his eyes. Then he looked across the street. The Brewers, who had been watching with triumphant certainty, were now a picture of confusion and dawning panic. They saw him being released, saw the deference in the sergeant's posture. Their simple, black-and-white narrative was bleeding into shades of gray they couldn't comprehend. Their smugness was evaporating under the heat of a mistake whose magnitude they were only just beginning to grasp. "Sergeant Walsh," Elijah said, turning back to the supervisor, "you will instruct those officers to remain here. You will take a full, detailed statement from Mr. and Mrs. Brewer. You will then secure all body camera footage and place Officers Calloway and Riggs on administrative desk duty pending a formal inquiry. Am I understood?" He wasn't asking. He was giving orders. "Yes, Detective," Walsh said without hesitation. In that moment, the chain of command had reasserted itself in the most brutal way imaginable. Elijah didn't wait for a reply. He walked past them, past the scene of his own humiliation, and back into his house. The cool air inside was a relief. He stood in the foyer for a long moment, his back against the closed door, just breathing. The silence of his home was absolute. He looked at his reflection in a hallway mirror. He saw the dirt on his cheek, the angry red scrapes on his arms, the wild, haunted look in his eyes. He didn't recognize the man staring back. He went upstairs, stripped off his clothes, and stood under a scalding hot shower for 20 minutes, scrubbing at his skin as if he could wash away the memory of the officer's hands on him, the feel of the cobblestones against his face. The physical pain was nothing. It was the other wounds, the invisible ones that would take longer to heal. After changing into a fresh set of clothes, slacks and a button-down shirt, his unofficial uniform, he made a decision. He would not let this rest. He would not let it be handled with a quiet apology and a mark in a personnel file. He walked back out to the Escalade, the vehicle that had been the unwitting catalyst for the whole ordeal. He got in, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway, pointedly ignoring the tableau of the two shamed officers, the bewildered sergeant, and the panicked neighbors. He drove not to the training facility but downtown, to the imposing granite building that housed the Atlanta Police Department headquarters. He badged himself through security, the guards greeting him with familiar nods. He walked the long, sterile hallways, his footsteps echoing. This building was his professional home, a place of order, of rules, of a shared mission. Today it felt alien. He didn't go to his own desk in the homicide division. He walked directly to the third floor, to a set of nondescript doors with a simple sign. Office of Professional Standards, Internal Affairs. He walked up to the duty officer's desk, a young cop who looked up at him with a respectful, "Morning, Detective." "I need to file a formal complaint," Elijah said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of all the morning's trauma. "And I need to speak with the ranking officer on duty, right now." The young officer's friendly demeanor evaporated, replaced by a look of serious concern. He saw Elijah's scraped hands and the grim set of his jaw. He picked up his phone without a word. The silence in the IA office was heavy, a prelude to the storm that was about to break over the entire department. Elijah wasn't just a victim anymore. He was the primary witness in the most important case of his career. The ranking officer on duty was Lieutenant Isabella Corrigan, the head of Internal Affairs. She was a woman in her early 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a reputation that preceded her down every hallway in the precinct. She was known to be meticulous, unsparing, and utterly immune to the blue wall of silence. To the rank and file, she was a feared internal inquisitor. To the command staff, she was a necessary, if uncomfortable, instrument of accountability. When her duty officer informed her that a decorated homicide detective was in her office to file a complaint against 2 patrol officers, she knew this was not a routine matter. She met Elijah in a small, soundproofed interview room. It was a sterile, impersonal space designed to encourage facts and discourage emotion. "Detective Vance," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "I'm Lieutenant Corrigan. Please have a seat. Tell me what happened." Elijah recounted the morning's events, his voice a low, controlled monotone. He was a trained observer, a professional witness. He stripped the story of his own rage and humiliation, presenting it as a sequence of procedural failures. He detailed the high-risk stop for a non-violent property crime call, the refusal to listen to his identification, the immediate escalation to physical force, the denial of his right to a supervisor until he forced the issue, and the blatant, prejudice-based logic used by the officers. He spoke for 15 minutes without interruption. Corrigan listened intently, her pen moving across a legal pad, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she asked only a few clarifying questions, her inquiries precise and targeted. "What was Officer Calloway's exact phrasing when you identified yourself? Did Officer Riggs activate his body camera before or after he exited the vehicle? At what point did Sergeant Walsh arrive?" "Detective," she said, her gaze steady, "I need the clothes you were wearing and will need to photograph your injuries no matter how minor they seem." It wasn't a request. She was already building a case, preserving evidence. "They're in my gym bag in my car," he replied. "Good. Now, I want your formal, on-the-record statement. We'll do it on video." She paused. "Elijah, I'm sorry this happened to you." It was the first time she had used his first name, a small crack in her professional armor, a sign that she understood this was not just a case file, but a profound violation. While Elijah gave his official statement, Corrigan set the gears of her investigation into motion with ruthless efficiency. She issued a direct order to Sergeant Walsh. Both Calloway and Riggs were to be brought to headquarters immediately. They were to be separated, and their access to the department's computer system revoked. They were not to communicate with each other under any circumstances. She then issued a subpoena for the 911 call recording and dispatched an IA investigator to retrieve the body camera footage from the evidence locker where Walsh had been instructed to deposit it. By early afternoon, Corrigan and her top investigator were sitting in a darkened viewing room, watching the footage on a large monitor. The first video was from Calloway's camera. The shaky, adrenaline-fueled footage was damning. It showed everything, just as Elijah had described. It captured Calloway's immediate, unquestioning acceptance of the Brewer's narrative. It recorded his sneering dismissal of Elijah's identity. It showed the violent takedown, an utterly unjustifiable use of force for a compliant subject. Most critically, it recorded Elijah's calm, repeated attempts to de-escalate, which Calloway had later described as belligerent. The camera's unblinking eye told the truth. They then watched Riggs's footage. It was even worse. The audio captured his high-pitched, frantic screaming, his eagerness to escalate. He could be heard muttering, "Another one of these!" as they pulled up, a clear indication of his prejudiced mindset before the encounter had even begun. His camera captured the moment he found Elijah's badge, his resentful surprise, and Calloway's subsequent contemptuous dismissal of it. Finally, they listened to the 911 call. Karen Brewer's frantic, high-pitched voice filled the room. Corrigan made a transcript, highlighting the key, fabricated phrases. "Very aggressive, threatening look, acting like he's on something, might be armed." They cross-referenced these claims with the video evidence. The footage clearly showed a calm, composed man being violently assaulted. The disparity wasn't just a misinterpretation, It was a deliberate, malicious lie designed to provoke exactly the response it had received. Corrigan leaned back in her chair, a grim expression on her face. This was not a gray area. This was not a case of a misunderstanding or a procedural error made in the heat of the moment. This was a textbook case of biased policing, excessive force, and a potential criminal conspiracy originating with a false report. She had everything she needed. The unblinking eyes of the cameras had captured the truth, frame by painstaking frame. Now, it was her job to make sure that truth was honored with swift and decisive justice. The storm was no longer gathering. It had made landfall directly over the Atlanta Police Department. 2 days later, Chad and Karen Brewer sat in another sterile, windowless room, this one at the Fulton County District Attorney's office. They had been summoned for an interview, a step they had initially viewed with a sense of importance. They believed they were the key witnesses, the concerned citizens who had stopped a major crime. They had dressed for the part, in crisp, conservative business casual attire. Their lawyer, a slick man more accustomed to negotiating real estate deals than criminal investigations, sat beside them, looking vaguely uncomfortable. Across the table sat a lead detective from the DA's Special Investigations Unit. He was a large, imposing man with a gentle voice that did little to soften the hard, discerning look in his eyes. "Mr. and Mrs. Brewer," the detective began, placing a small digital recorder on the table. "Thank you for coming in. We're just trying to tie up some loose ends regarding the incident on Saturday. Could you walk me through what you saw, in your own words?" Chad leaned forward, eager to perform. "Of course, Detective. We saw a man we didn't recognize lurking around our neighbor's Escalade. He was acting suspiciously, testing the doors. It was obvious he was about to steal it. My wife Karen did the right thing and called 911. We were terrified." The detective nodded slowly, making a note. "Terrified. And you, Mrs. Brewer, you were the one who made the call?" "Yes," Karen said, her voice a carefully rehearsed blend of fragility and resolve. "I was. He was very aggressive. When he saw us watching, he glared. It was a threatening look. I was afraid he had a weapon. I told the dispatcher we didn't feel safe." The detective scribbled another note. "Aggressive, threatening, possibly armed, I see." He let the silence hang in the room for a moment before continuing. "So he was trying to force the doors, jimmying the lock, something like that?" "Well, yes, exactly," Chad jumped in. "It looked like he was trying to get in any way he could. It was broad daylight, the arrogance of it." The detective held up a hand. "I understand. Now, Mrs. Brewer, on the 911 call, you stated, and I quote, 'He's yelling at me now.' Could you describe what he was yelling?" Karen's eyes flickered toward her husband. A hint of uncertainty crept into her voice. It was more of a menacing, a tone. He was muttering things." "So he wasn't yelling at you?" the detective pressed gently. "Not directly, but the intent was clear," she insisted. The detective nodded again, his expression neutral. "I see." He reached down and pulled a laptop from his briefcase, placing it on the table and turning it to face them. "We're fortunate in this day and age to have excellent records. This is the body camera footage from the first responding officer, synced with the audio from your 911 call. I'd like you to watch it with me." He pressed play. The video was clear, the audio crisp. The screen showed Elijah, calm and composed by his car. On the audio track, Karen's frantic, panicked voice was heard making her report. The detective let it play. They saw Elijah get into his car. They heard Karen scream into the phone, "He's getting in the car now! He's going to drive away with it!" Followed by the arrival of the police. Then the detective paused the video. Now, as you can see here, the subject, Detective Vance, is speaking in a calm, low tone. There is no yelling. You stated he gave you a threatening look. At what point in the video did you see that? Chad and Karen stared at the frozen image of Elijah's face. There was no threat, no aggression. There was only a man, standing in his own driveway. The blood began to drain from Karen's face. "And Mr. Brewer," the detective continued, his voice still soft, "you stated he was testing the doors, jimmying the lock. The video from multiple angles, including a neighbor's security camera, shows Detective Vance using a key fob to unlock the vehicle and then checking a rear passenger door that was already unlocked. At no point does he attempt to force entry. Can you explain that discrepancy? Chad opened his mouth, but no words came out. His confident narrative, so solid and real in his own mind, was dissolving under the harsh, objective light of reality. Their story was not just inconsistent, it was a complete fabrication. The detective leaned forward, his gentle demeanor gone, replaced by a cold, hard focus. Mrs. Brewer, lying to a 911 operator is a crime. Filing a false police report is a crime. Maliciously summoning an emergency response, especially when you invent details like aggression and weapons that could get an innocent man killed, is a very serious crime. The lawyer cleared his throat and jumped in. My clients may have misinterpreted what they saw. The detective cut him off, his eyes locked on Karen. Did you misinterpret, Mrs. Brewer? Or did you lie? Because this video, the 911 recording, and the testimony of a decorated police detective tell a very different story than the one you've been telling. And I need to know which one is the truth. Karen Brewer stared at the detective, her carefully constructed world collapsing around her. The righteousness, the fear, the civic duty, it all melted away, leaving only the cold, ugly truth of her prejudice and the terrifying legal consequences that were about to rain down upon her. She opened her mouth, and the only sound that came out was a choked, desperate sob. The lie had died, and they were about to be buried with it. While the Brewers' world was imploding in the DA's office, officers Calloway and Riggs were facing their own reckoning in the sterile, unforgiving confines of the Internal Affairs Division. They had been separated for 2 days, stripped of their weapons and badges, and left to stew in their own anxiety. Now, it was time for their formal interviews. Calloway went first. He walked into the interview room with a practiced swagger, an attempt to project a confidence he no longer felt. He saw himself as a victim of circumstance, a good cop who had made a tough call based on a hot report. He was prepared to defend his actions vigorously. Lieutenant Corrigan and another IA investigator sat across the table from him, a thick file between them. Officer Calloway, Corrigan began, her voice devoid of emotion. Your union representative is present. This is a formal, recorded interview regarding your conduct during the arrest of Detective Elijah Vance. Let's start from the beginning. You received a dispatch for a car theft in progress. That's correct, Lieutenant, Calloway said, leaning back in his chair. A 1053V, reported by a concerned citizen. We responded Code 3 as per protocol. Arrived on scene, saw the suspect matching the description by the vehicle. The situation was tense. We had to assume he was armed and dangerous. Corrigan's eyes were like chips of ice. You assumed. Based on what? The 911 call? The call and my training, Calloway stated. The suspect was agitated, non-compliant. Let's talk about that, Corrigan interrupted, opening the file. I have your body camera footage right here, and a transcript. Detective Vance's first words to you were, Sir, I am a police officer. Your response was, Oh, you're a cop now, are you? Shut your mouth. Is that how you de-escalate a situation, Calloway? Calloway's composure began to crack. He could have been lying. It's a common tactic. He then told you exactly where his credentials and service weapon were. He was attempting to comply, to provide you with a path to the truth. You and your partner responded by screaming at him to get on the ground. Why didn't you simply ask him to place his hands on the vehicle and wait while you ran the car's license plate? That would be standard procedure for a suspected auto theft, would it not? The situation was dynamic, Calloway blustered, falling back on well-worn jargon. We had to neutralize the threat first. What threat? Corrigan's voice was sharp. The threat of an unarmed man standing calmly by his own car, telling you he is a police officer. You created the dynamism. You created the threat. She slid a series of glossy photos across the table. They were stills from his own body camera. This is you, with your weapon drawn and pointed at a fellow officer's head. This is your partner, driving his knee into that officer's back after he was already on the ground. And this, she said, pushing the last photo forward, is you, dismissing his badge after you confirmed it was real, saying, and I quote, "A badge doesn't mean you can't be a crook." Do you stand by that statement, officer? Calloway stared at the images of his own actions. Seen in the cold, still frame of a photograph, his conduct looked less like proactive policing and more like a brutal assault. The wall of his justifications began to crumble. In the heat of the moment, I made a judgment call. You made a judgment, Corrigan corrected him. You judged a black man in a nice car in a rich neighborhood to be a criminal before you even stepped out of your vehicle. You refused to listen to him, refused to investigate, and used a level of force that was grossly disproportionate and completely unnecessary. You didn't make a mistake, Officer Calloway. You made a choice, and so did your partner. Riggs's interview was even shorter. He was visibly terrified, his youth and inexperience showing. He tried to blame Calloway's leadership, saying he was just following the senior officer's lead. Corrigan dismantled his defense in minutes, playing back his own audio where he was heard making prejudiced remarks and eagerly escalating the situation. He was not a follower. He was a willing participant. He broke down completely, offering a pathetic, rambling apology that was less about remorse for his actions and more about fear for his career. By the end of the day, the preliminary report was on the deputy chief's desk. The recommendation was clear and unanimous. Based on the irrefutable video and audio evidence, Officers Calloway and Riggs were found to have violated multiple department policies, including biased policing, excessive use of force, failure to follow procedure, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The next morning, they were summoned not to an interview room, but to the deputy chief's office. They were formally served with papers notifying them of their immediate and indefinite suspension without pay, pending a termination hearing. They were escorted to their lockers, made to clean them out under the watchful eye of a supervisor, and then walked out of the building, stripped of the identity that had defined their adult lives. The blue wall, which they had believed to be an impenetrable fortress that would protect them, had not just cracked, it had been demolished, and they were left standing in the rubble. The shock waves from the internal affairs investigation did not stop at the police department's walls. Lieutenant Corrigan's comprehensive report, including the body camera footage, the 911 transcript, and the starkly contradictory statements from Chad and Karen Brewer, was hand-delivered to the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. It landed on the desk of District Attorney Alistair Hayes, a shrewd, politically ambitious prosecutor with a keen sense for cases that resonated with the public conscience. Hayes reviewed the file himself, his brow furrowing deeper with every page. This was not just another case of a false police report. This was a perfect, self-contained illustration of a deep societal sickness. The victim was not only an innocent man, but a highly respected member of law enforcement. The perpetrators were affluent, privileged citizens who had weaponized the 911 system. The evidence, thanks to modern technology, was ironclad and damning. It was, from a prosecutor's standpoint, a gift. It was an opportunity to send a powerful, unambiguous message that using the police as a personal enforcement service for one's own prejudices would have severe consequences. He assigned the case to his best trial attorney, a relentless prosecutor named Jenna Ramirez, known for her sharp cross-examinations and her refusal to offer lenient plea bargains in cases involving abuse of the justice system. A week later, D.A. Hayes stood before a packed room of reporters and television cameras. The harsh lights glinted off the bank of microphones on the podium. He cleared his throat, his expression grim and resolute. "Good morning," he began, his voice resonating through the room. "Today, my office is announcing the filing of criminal charges against Mr. Chad Brewer and Mrs. Karen Brewer in connection with an incident that occurred on May 14th in the Havenwood Estates." A murmur went through the press corps. "The charges," Hayes continued, his voice rising with conviction, are as follows. Filing a false police report, a gross misdemeanor, and maliciously summoning an emergency response, a specific and serious statute designed to penalize those who knowingly and willfully misuse our 911 system for purposes of harassment or based on prejudice. Furthermore, we are seeking a hate crime enhancement, given the clear racial animus that motivated the defendant's actions. The mention of a hate crime enhancement sent a jolt through the room. This elevated the case from a simple procedural crime to something far more significant. Let me be perfectly clear, Hayes declared, leaning into the microphones. The 911 system is a sacred lifeline, intended for citizens in genuine peril. It is not a tool to be wielded as a weapon. The actions of Mr. and Mrs. Brewer were not a simple mistake or a misunderstanding. They were a calculated and malicious fabrication. They invented a narrative of aggression, of threats, of potential violence, where none existed. They did so for one reason. They saw a black man in a neighborhood where they believed he did not belong. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Their actions created an incredibly dangerous and volatile situation that could have easily ended in tragedy. It was only due to the remarkable composure and professionalism of the victim, Detective Elijah Vance, that a deadly outcome was averted. The Brewers did not just waste valuable city resources, they put a man's life and the lives of the responding officers at risk. This office will not tolerate the weaponization of prejudice. Mr. and Mrs. Brewer will be held fully and completely accountable for their actions in a court of law. The news exploded. Local and national media outlets picked up the story, often leading with the dramatic headline, "Couple charged with hate crime for calling 911 on decorated black detective." The Brewers' names, and in some reports, their carefully curated social media photos, were broadcast everywhere. They became instant pariahs, the faces of suburban racism. Their digital lives were flooded with vitriol. Chad's employer asked him to take an indefinite leave of absence. The neighborhood association sent them a formal letter of censure. The comfortable, protected world they had paid so dearly to enter had become a prison of their own making. The lawyer they had hired, realizing he was far out of his depth, advised them that the DA's office was not bluffing. There would be no quiet deal, no simple fine. Ramirez was preparing for a full-blown jury trial. The Brewers were no longer the concerned citizens, the heroes of their own story. They were defendants, facing mounting legal fees, public ruin, and the very real possibility of a criminal record and jail time. The gavel of civilian justice was about to fall, and it was aimed directly at them. The termination of officers Calloway and Riggs was swift and decisive. A departmental tribunal, presented with the overwhelming evidence from the Internal Affairs report, unanimously voted for their dismissal. The police union filed a perfunctory grievance, but it was a hollow gesture. The video evidence was too damning, the political pressure too intense. Their careers in law enforcement were over, ending not with a bang, but with the quiet, bureaucratic finality of a termination letter. For the Atlanta Police Department, however, firing 2 officers was like putting a small bandage on a gaping wound. The Elijah Vance incident, as it was now being called in the media, had become a public relations catastrophe. It exposed a rot within the department that went far beyond the actions of 2 rogue cops. It raised deeply uncomfortable questions. How many other Calloways and Riggses were still on the force? How many similar incidents had gone unrecorded, ending with a false arrest or worse, without the victim being a high-ranking detective capable of navigating the system? The department's very soul was on trial in the court of public opinion. The current chief of police, a man named Michael O'Connell, was a 35-year veteran of the old guard. He was a skilled administrator and a shrewd politician, but he was fundamentally ill-equipped to handle a crisis of this nature. His initial public statement was a disaster of tone-deaf bureaucratic language, speaking of an unfortunate incident and promising a full review of protocols. To a city demanding accountability, His words sounded like a weak attempt to sweep the problem under the rug. Community leaders, civil rights activists, and city council members were in an uproar. Protesters began gathering outside police headquarters, their signs bearing Elijah's name and calling for systemic change. The scandal dominated local news cycles. Every report replayed snippets of the body camera footage, the humiliating images of a decorated detective being brutalized by his own. Chief O'Connell found himself under siege. In city council meetings, he was grilled relentlessly about the department's training on de-escalation and implicit bias. When it was revealed, through a reporter's investigation, that both Callaway and Riggs were long overdue for their mandatory bias training, the public outcry intensified. It was further discovered that Callaway had several prior citizen complaints for overly aggressive behavior, all of which had been dismissed at the supervisory level with a simple "officer acted within policy." The pattern of behavior was clear, and the department's failure to address it was undeniable. The mayor, facing an election year and seeing the political tide turning against the department's leadership, knew that a symbolic sacrifice was needed. Behind closed doors, she gave Chief O'Connell an ultimatum: resign gracefully, or be fired publicly. A week later, a weary and defeated Chief O'Connell stood at a podium and announced his immediate retirement, citing a desire to spend more time with his family. Everyone knew it was a forced resignation. His departure left a massive power vacuum at the top of the APD. The department was now adrift, its reputation in tatters, its morale at an all-time low, and its relationship with the community it was sworn to protect completely broken. The city was in crisis, but with crisis came an opportunity. The search for a new chief of police began immediately. The mayor and the city council made it clear that they weren't looking for another old guard administrator. They needed a reformer. They needed someone who understood the deep, systemic issues of modern policing. They needed a leader who could not only restore public trust, but also heal the department from within. They needed someone with unimpeachable integrity, courage, and a profound personal understanding of what was at stake. The city began its search for a true leader, unaware that the perfect candidate was already among them, a quiet homicide detective who had been forged into the very symbol of the change they so desperately needed. The years that followed the incident were transformative for Elijah Vance. The external storm eventually subsided. The Brewers, after a humiliating public trial, were convicted on the misdemeanor charges, receiving probation, a hefty fine, and court-ordered community service. They sold their house on Serenity Lane and disappeared into obscurity, their names forever linked to a viral cautionary tale about prejudice. Callaway and Riggs lost their jobs and were unable to find work in law enforcement again. The immediate consequences were settled, but the internal impact on Elijah was far more complex and enduring. He never spoke of the incident with his colleagues unless it was absolutely necessary. He didn't want their pity or their awkward, fumbling apologies on behalf of a system that had failed him. But the event had left an indelible mark, a network of scars on his soul. For a time, he felt a profound sense of alienation from the uniform he had worn with such pride. Every time he saw a patrol car make a sudden stop, a part of him tensed up. The memory of the cold steel of the handcuffs and the rough texture of the cobblestones was never far from the surface. Some men might have become bitter. Some might have quit the force, taking a lucrative settlement and a quiet retirement. But Elijah's anger, as intense as it was a clean, focused flame. He saw what happened to him not just as a personal violation, but as a systemic failure of catastrophic proportions. He had survived because of his rank and his training, but he couldn't stop thinking about the countless others who didn't have those advantages. The young man with a broken taillight, the teenager walking home in a hoodie, the woman who fit a vague description. What happened to them when they encountered a Callaway and a Riggs? That question became the driving force of his career. He channeled the trauma not into resentment, but into a quiet, unshakable resolve. He turned down a promotion to a cushy administrative role and instead requested a transfer to the police academy. He wanted to be on the front lines, not of the streets, but of the department's culture. At the academy, he became a legend. He taught courses on de-escalation, constitutional law, and most importantly, a groundbreaking new class he designed himself called The Anatomy of a Bad Stop. In it, he used his own case as the primary teaching tool. With a stoicism that stunned the recruits, he would play his own body camera footage on a large screen, dissecting every procedural failure, every biased assumption, every missed opportunity to use reason instead of force. "Look here," he would say, pausing the video on Calloway's enraged face. "This is not confidence. This is fear. He's afraid of being challenged, of being wrong, and that fear makes him dangerous. Your badge does not give you the right to be right. It gives you the responsibility to find out what is right." He became a mentor to the young officers, particularly the minority recruits who saw in him a leader who understood their unique struggles. He wasn't just teaching them tactics. He was teaching them a philosophy of policing rooted in empathy, integrity, and a profound respect for the rights of the citizens they would encounter. He was a constant, living reminder of the immense harm the department was capable of and the immense good it could achieve if it held itself to a higher standard. He wasn't trying to climb the ladder. He was rebuilding the ladder from the ground up, one rung, one recruit at a time. He was no longer just a detective. He was becoming the conscience of the Atlanta Police Department. 5 years had passed. The Atlanta Police Department had cycled through 2 different chiefs since O'Connell's forced retirement. The first was an outsider from Los Angeles, a reformer who brought in a raft of new policies but failed to win the trust of the rank and file, resigning in frustration after just 2 years. The second was a department insider, a deputy chief who was popular with the union but was perceived by the community as a return to the old ways, unable to meaningfully connect with the city's diverse population or enact the deep systemic changes that were still so desperately needed. The department remained adrift, caught between a past it couldn't escape and a future it couldn't quite grasp. Now the city was once again searching for a new chief of police. The mayor, a pragmatic and increasingly progressive leader, was determined to get it right this time. She convened a special citizens advisory committee, composed of community activists, business leaders, and religious figures, to assist in the national search. The committee interviewed candidates from Chicago, New York, and Philadelphia. They were all impressive, with polished resumes and slick presentations full of buzzwords like community engagement and data-driven policing. Yet something was missing. They all felt like outsiders, offering textbook solutions to a city whose wounds were unique and deeply personal. During one particularly contentious committee meeting, a respected and outspoken pastor, Reverend Althea Harris, slammed her hand on the table in frustration. "We keep looking for a savior from another city," she declared, her voice ringing with passion. "But none of them understand the soul of Atlanta. None of them have felt the betrayal that our communities have felt. We don't need another consultant. We need a healer. We need someone with moral authority." Her words hung in the air. The committee chair, a well-connected lawyer, sighed. "Who, Reverend? Who in this department has that kind of authority right now?" It was a young community organizer, a man who had once been a fierce critic of the APD, who spoke up. "There is one," he said quietly. Everyone turned to look at him. "A man who teaches at the academy. My nephew just graduated and says he's the only instructor who tells the truth. A detective named Elijah Vance." The name landed in the room like a stone in a still pond. Elijah Vance, the man from the incident, the man who had become a living symbol of the department's worst failings and its potential for redemption. He wasn't a chief, a deputy, or even a captain. He was a detective who had taken a deliberate step back from the command track. The lawyer scoffed. "Vance? He's a detective. He doesn't have the administrative experience to run a department of this size." "To hell with administrative experience," Reverend Harris thundered. "We've had administrators. Look where it got us. Does he have integrity? Does he have courage? Does he have the respect of the young officers and the community? That's the experience we need right now. The idea, at first dismissed as radical, began to take root. His name was floated to the mayor. She was intrigued. It was a bold, unconventional choice. Politically, it was a masterstroke. Appointing Vance would be a powerful, symbolic act of atonement and a clear signal that the city was serious about reform. But she needed to know if he was more than just a symbol. She called Elijah to her office for a private, off-the-record meeting. She expected to meet a man hardened by bitterness, but instead she found a quiet, thoughtful leader who spoke not of his own grievance, but of his deep, abiding belief in the idea of policing as a noble calling. He didn't talk about changing policies, he talked about changing the culture. He spoke of accountability, transparency, and building trust, not as abstract goals, but as the fundamental, non-negotiable foundation of the job. He didn't campaign for the position. He simply answered her questions with the same calm, unwavering integrity he had shown on that terrible Saturday morning 5 years ago. The mayor left the meeting convinced. He was not just the symbolic choice, he was the right choice. 2 weeks later, at a packed press conference at City Hall, the mayor of Atlanta stepped to the podium. "It is my great honor," she announced, her voice filled with a genuine sense of hope, "to nominate as our next chief of police a man of extraordinary courage, profound integrity, and an unshakable commitment to justice. I am proud to introduce you to our next chief, Detective Elijah Vance." The room erupted in a storm of flashing cameras and stunned applause. Elijah, standing beside her in a simple, perfectly tailored suit, looked out at the crowd, his expression serene, his resolve absolute. The journey from the cobblestones of his driveway had led him to this podium, and he was ready for the immense task that lay ahead. The first day was a whirlwind of handshakes, briefings, and the formal swearing-in ceremony at City Hall. But for Chief Elijah Vance, the most important meeting of the day was scheduled for 3 p.m. in the main briefing room at police headquarters, the very same room where roll call was held, where the daily rhythms of the department were set. He had called a mandatory meeting of his entire command staff, all deputy chiefs, majors, captains, and lieutenants. As he walked into the room, a hush fell over the assembled group of about 50 high-ranking officers. These were the leaders of the department, the veterans, the power brokers. Many of them he knew. Some had been his supervisors, some his peers. Today, he was their boss. He wore the crisp, new uniform of the chief of police, the 4 gold stars on his collar gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He walked not to the podium at the front, but to the center of the room, creating a sense of intimacy, of a direct and unfiltered conversation. He looked around, making eye contact with the men and women who now reported to him. He saw a mixture of expressions: curiosity, respect, apprehension, and, in a few of the older faces, a hint of resentment. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice the same calm, steady baritone it had always been. It needed no amplification to command the room. "I know many of you are wondering what kind of chief I'm going to be. You're wondering about my agenda, about the changes I plan to make. And we will get to all of that. But first, I think it's important that we all start from the same place, with a shared understanding of why I am standing here today." He gestured to a large monitor on the wall. "Roll the video," he said to an aide. The screen flickered to life. There was no sound at first, just the shaky first-person view from a body camera on a bright, sunny day. The command staff watched as the patrol car raced down a quiet suburban street. They saw it swerve to a stop behind a black Escalade. They saw the door fly open and a pistol come into view. And then they saw him. A younger version of the man standing before them, dressed in a polo shirt and shorts, being screamed at by 2 of their own. A low murmur of disbelief and discomfort rippled through the room. They had all heard the stories, but few had seen the raw footage. Elijah let the video play. He didn't narrate or editorialize. He forced them to watch the entire ugly spectacle in silence. They watched him calmly identify himself. They watched Calloway sneer and dismiss him. They watched him being forced to the ground, the camera lurching as his face hit the pavement. They watched him being cuffed, searched, and shoved into the back of the car. They saw the smug, satisfied faces of the couple who had made the call. They watched the arrival of Sergeant Walsh, his slow, dawning horror as he realized the truth. Elijah let the video play until the moment his younger self drove away from the scene. Then he had the aide stop it. The room was deathly silent. No one moved. The faces of the command staff were grim, a mixture of shame and shock. "That," Elijah said, his voice quiet but powerful, "is why I am here. Not because of what happened to me, but because of what that video represents. It represents a catastrophic failure at every level, a failure of training, a failure of supervision, a failure of our most fundamental duty to see people as citizens, not as suspects." He looked around the room, his gaze piercing. "The question that has haunted me for 5 years is not, why did this happen to me? The question that keeps me up at night is, what would have happened if I wasn't a detective? What if I had been a plumber, a teacher, a software engineer who had worked his entire life to afford that house and that car? He would have been arrested. He would have been charged. His life would have been ruined. And in the worst-case scenario, given the aggression of those officers, he could have been killed. All for the crime of loading a gym bag into his own car." He let that sink in. "My title is the only thing that saved me, and that is a moral stain on this department. A citizen's safety and their rights cannot depend on their job title, or the neighborhood they live in, or the color of their skin. It must depend on our unwavering commitment to fair, impartial, and constitutional policing. That day, that commitment failed. And my mission, our new mission starting today, is to ensure that it never fails again." He outlined his immediate plans: a complete overhaul of de-escalation and implicit bias training, making it a mandatory hands-on quarterly requirement; a new duty to intervene policy, making it a fireable offense to witness misconduct by a fellow officer and do nothing; a transparent public dashboard to track citizen complaints and use of force incidents. "Some of you will resist these changes," he concluded, his voice like steel. "Some of you will think this is a political overreaction. Those of you who think that way do not belong in a leadership position in this department. We will hold our officers accountable, and I will hold all of you accountable for holding them accountable. The culture changes today. It changes now. This is our department. Let's make it one we can all be proud of. Dismissed." He turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a stunned and silent command staff. The new era of the Atlanta Police Department had begun. The view from the Chief of Police's office was panoramic. Through the large plate glass window, Elijah could see the sprawling, vibrant cityscape of Atlanta, a complex tapestry of steel, glass, and green spaces. In the distance, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The city was beautiful from up here, its complexities and contradictions softened by the distance. It was a view he had never imagined having. The chair he sat in, a large leather seat of authority, still felt foreign. It didn't feel like a throne of power, but a seat of immense, crushing responsibility. The day had been long, the beginning of a long journey. As the quiet of the evening settled over his office, he found his thoughts drifting back not to the meetings or the policies, but to that sun-drenched Saturday morning 5 years ago. He thought about Chad and Karen Brewer. What drove them? It wasn't some cartoonish, mustache-twirling villainy. It was something far more insidious and, in many ways, more common. It was a potent, toxic cocktail of implicit bias, territorial anxiety, and a deep-seated belief in a fragile world order that they felt compelled to police. In their minds, a black man in casual clothes with a luxury SUV in their new, expensive neighborhood was a cognitive dissonance, a puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture they had paid for. His presence disrupted their narrative of what safety and success were supposed to look like. Their 911 call wasn't just a report of a suspected crime. It was an attempt to restore their version of order, to forcibly jam the puzzle piece they deemed out of place into a box labeled criminal. Their fear, whether genuine or performative, served as a license, a justification to abandon reason and to fully embrace a prejudice they likely would have denied they even possessed. They were not evil people in their own story. They were heroes, protecting their castle from a perceived invader. And that, he knew, was the most dangerous kind of prejudice there is. He also found himself, as he often did, replaying the what-if scenarios, the razor-thin margins upon which his life had balanced that day. What if he hadn't spent 2 decades cultivating an almost inhuman level of emotional control? What if he had let the righteous anger show? What if he had raised his voice, argued, or made a sudden frustrated gesture? Calloway and Riggs were primed for violence, looking for any excuse to validate their initial aggressive assumptions. A single misstep, a single surrender to a perfectly human emotion would have transformed him from uncooperative to resisting, giving them the justification they so desperately sought to use overwhelming force. What if there had been no Sergeant Walsh? What if the supervisor who arrived had been a clone of Calloway, a man whose first loyalty was to protect his officers, right or wrong? The narrative would have been set in stone. It would have been his word against 3 officers and 2 concerned citizens. Without a supervisor willing to seek the truth over tribal loyalty, his badge would have remained meaningless, his career and freedom forfeit. The outcome hinged not just on his own composure, but on the integrity of a single man in a position to enforce procedure. The ultimate lesson of his journey, he realized, was not about the specifics of his own event, but about the fragile nature of justice itself. It reminded him that true accountability isn't a passive state. It's an active, ongoing fight. It requires the courage of a bystander to record, the integrity of a supervisor to question, and the resolve of a leader to turn a personal injustice into a catalyst for systemic change. It teaches us that the battle against prejudice isn't won in grand, sweeping declarations, but in the small, difficult, individual choices we make every day. The choice to question our own assumptions. The choice to demand accountability when we witness an injustice. His story had found a resolution, a cinematic, almost unbelievable ending. But he knew that countless others do not. They end on the side of a road, in a cold jail cell, or in a brief, tragic news report. His new position wasn't a prize, it was a debt. A debt to all the people whose stories didn't end with a press conference and a promotion. From this chair, with this view, he had a chance to start repaying it. The city hummed below, a living entity full of millions of stories unfolding at once. He hoped to make a few of them a little safer, a little more just. What would you have done if you were a neighbor who witnessed this unfold? Do you believe a person's character is truly revealed only in moments of extreme pressure like this? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice is essential in keeping these important conversations moving forward.